Segment 21A, Introduction. It's instructive to compare the United States' birth in 1776 with the 1917 birth of the Soviet Union. Like the founding fathers of the United States, Vladimir Ilyich Lenin and the Bolsheviks wanted to create an entirely new form of government based on lofty ideals such as equality, personal liberty, and the rule of law. Like the infant United States, the new Soviet Union was forced to fight very hard for its very existence, and it came close to losing more than once. But that is where the similarities end. As we will discover in segment 21B, Democracy Fails, the promise of Russia's February Revolution was destroyed by the Russian lack of any democratic tradition. The Tsarist government was succeeded by two bodies which competed for power: the Provisional Government, which had sprung out of the Duma, and the Petrograd Soviet, which represented the workers and the soldiers of Russia. The various non-Russian nationalities, such as the Ukrainians, the Balts, Georgians, Finnish, and Poles, wanted out of the Russian Empire for good. The great majority of the Russian Empire's peoples wanted merely to eat and to have a warm place to live. And meanwhile, the unpopular World War I continued. Should Russia's provisional government continue to fight the Central Powers? Could it continue to fight? Stay tuned. In segment 21C, Lenin and the Bolsheviks, we will meet Lenin and the Bolshevik Party he built around his towering personality. Lenin hadn't foreseen the February Revolution. In fact, he was living in Swiss exile with his wife at the time. He was very close, in fact, to giving up the fight. But the German government, hoping to sabotage Russia's war effort, gave Lenin one-way passage to St. Petersburg with a nice pile of money to spend however he saw fit. Even Lenin's closest associates, men like Lev Trotsky and Joseph Stalin, refused to believe it was time to rise up against the provisional government. As always, Lenin got his way with the Bolshevik Party, and this time he was absolutely right. Segment 21D, Red October, shows us just how amazing, if amazing is the right word for an event which caused so much misery, the October Revolution was. The Bolsheviks were mostly bookworms and rabble-rousers, with no military experience and even less government experience. They had no widespread political support. Their only two advantages were control of the Petrograd Soviet and, as always, Vladimir Lenin's mad leadership skills. Unfortunately for history, the provisional government of Russia was downright inept. Just how did a handful of zealots based in St. Petersburg get their hands on nearly the entirety of the former Russian Empire? Segment 21B, Democracy Fails. On March 15, 1917, Tsar Nicholas II abdicated the Russian throne to the next in line, his younger brother, Grand Duke Mikhail. When Mikhail refused to accept the throne, this marked the end of the Romanov dynasty and of the Russian Empire. Later that month, Nicholas II was arrested and imprisoned with his family at their palace at Tsarskoye Selo, southeast of Petrograd. The entire family was ultimately deported to Yekaterinburg in the Ural Mountains. On July 17, 1918, the entire former royal family was executed by order of Lenin. As rumor had it, the youngest daughter, Anastasia, somehow survived. In fact, the so-called Anastasia was actually a middle-class Polish woman who merely thought she was Grand Duchess Anastasia of Russia. On August 14, 2000, Nicholas, Alexandra, and their children, Olga, Tatiana, Maria, Anastasia, and the Tsarevich Alexei, were canonized as saints of the Russian Orthodox Church. The governmental void was filled by something called double power. In other words, two institutions fought for actual power: the newly established Petrograd Soviet and the Provisional Government. The Provisional Government had evolved from the Tsar's Duma. Foreign powers, therefore, generally recognized it as Russia's legitimate government. Working out of its headquarters in the Winter Palace, the Provisional Government hopes to build a foundation for Russian democracy. Still, it was provisional. Its members had no experience in running anything, and they were waiting for the election of Russia's first Constituent Assembly, scheduled for fall 1917. They might have acted faster had they understood the extent of Russia's problems. A new democratic Russian republic was part of the solution, but just part. The peasants were restless for food and for land. The urban working class, proletariat, still wanted better living and working conditions. Most of all, everybody was fed up with the war. To be fair, there were no easy answers. But to the Russian people, the provisional government stood mostly for good intentions and hot air. Oddly, the provisional government shared one prominent leader with their rivals in the Petrograd Soviet. Alexander Kerensky was both vice chair of the Soviet and Minister of Justice in the provincial government. He would become more prominent as the year progressed. The Petrograd Soviet was built on the model of the 1905 St. Petersburg Soviet, where Lev Trotsky had first attained prominence. By the time of Nicholas's abdication, the Petrograd Soviet numbered about 3,000 deputies elected by the local factory workers and soldiers. As a result, the Soviet enjoyed great influence over industry, transportation, and the military. Soon, Soviets, or councils, sprang up all over Russia, both in urban and in rural areas. A national organization of Soviets was established in Petrograd. The Soviets were not always one and the same with the Bolshevik Party. Indeed, the Soviets were first controlled by the Mensheviks and the Socialist Revolutionaries, who were nowhere near as extreme as the Bolsheviks. But the Bolsheviks got the upper hand in the Soviets due to their lack of operating rules. Whoever yelled the loudest, controlled the most armed supporters, or had the most willpower usually won. Gradually, the Bolsheviks took the lead in all three categories. Meanwhile, the First World War continued to proceed disastrously, sucking away desperately needed manpower and resources for no good reason. The Petrograd Soviet's Order Number 1, which set up soldiers' councils in every unit and called for the election of officers, hardly helped military effectiveness. The Bolsheviks went the Soviets one better. They called for unconditional peace with the Central Powers of Germany and Austria. That is, peace without annexation or payments of reparations. Meanwhile, the Allies wanted the Provisional Government to continue Russia's role in the war against the Central Powers. Though the Russians were losing the war, they were still tying down German and Austrian troops who would otherwise fight the Allies on the Western Front. That summer, Alexander Kerensky, now the Minister of War, unleashed an offensive against the Austrians on the Eastern Front. The so-called Kerensky Offensive was successful at first, but it ground to a halt as soon as German troops were transferred from the west to stabilize the front. Again, the Western Allies were saved by Russian bloodshed. This time around, though, the Russian soldiers had been radicalized by Order Number 1 and by Soviet propaganda. They began to desert in droves rather than die fighting not for Russia, but for the Western Allies. On July 8, 1917, Alexander Kerensky was promoted again to to Prime Minister of the Provisional Government. Desperate to save the Russian army, he put a strict disciplinarian, General Kornilov, in charge. A comedy of errors ensued. Kornilov assumed that he'd been given complete control over the Russian military. When he was ordered to dispatch troops against the Petrograd Soviet, he took it to mean that Kerensky had appointed him co-dictator. Instead, in September, Kerensky talked the Petrograd Soviet into helping him fight General Kornilov. On September 15, 1917, Russia was formally declared to be a republic, under the leader of Kerensky as President, Interior Minister, and Supreme Commander of the Army and Navy. If you weren't able to follow that last confusing story, don't feel bad. Nobody else at the time understood what was going on either. But you should have a pretty good idea of how ineffective the provisional government truly was. It basically turned into the dictatorship of the self-adoring blowhard Alexander Kerensky. Segment 21C, Lenin and the Bolsheviks. The Bolshevik Party started in 1903 in London, England, of all places. Since Russia's political parties were still officially illegal, the Russian Social Democratic Party's convention had to take place far from the Russian secret police. As devout Marxists, the Social Democrats believed in Karl Marx's forecast of a world revolution. They agreed with Marx that the Russian working class, the proletariat, and not the sluggish peasants, would be at the forefront of the Russian Revolution. On nearly everything else, they disagreed strongly. At the 1903 London Congress, Russia's socialists split into two factions. One was the Menshevik, or minority faction, which stood for business as usual, discussing theory and tactics, waiting for the proletariat to show up, and signing up anyone who wanted to help. The Bolshevik, or majority faction, led by Vladimir Ilyich Lenin, wanted a smaller party of hardcore revolutionaries, committed to kick-starting the revolution in Russia by whatever means Lenin ordered. Although the Bolsheviks had a majority in London, back in Russia there were actually far more Mensheviks. The Bolsheviks' fanaticism cut them off from the usual socialist sources of funding and made the Bolsheviks resort to expropriations, that is, bank robbery, or robbery of money in transit. One of the most talented expropriators was a young Georgian, Iosif Djugashvili, better known to history as Joseph Stalin. In fact, the Bolsheviks were so weak that they were nearly invisible throughout the revolution of 1905. Lev Trotsky, who did play an important role in 1905, was a Menshevik at the time. He only joined the Bolsheviks in 1917. Why were the Bolsheviks so weak in the beginning? Well, the Tsar's secret police was watching them carefully. But they were watching the Mensheviks, the socialist revolutionaries, and the other parties no less carefully. The Mensheviks were more open to other people and other ideas. The socialist revolutionaries, who were not Marxist, were far better organized. They also had a clear program, an 8-hour day for the workers, a constituent assembly, and giving all the farmland to the peasants. But the Bolsheviks' greatest weakness was also its greatest strength, the intellect, determination, and driving personality of Vladimir Ilyich Lenin. Lenin believed that the revolution had to be led by an educated, disciplined elite, not a mass of backward factory workers and peasants. Though Lenin was quite at home in the convoluted world of Marxist theory, he was totally pragmatic. He might change his position, or form an alliance, or break an old one, but the bottom line was always the success of the revolution. For Lenin, the end always justified the means of achieving it. Vladimir Ilyich Ulyanov was born May 4, 1870 in Simbirsk to a noble family. His older brother Alexander was hung in 1886 for his part in a plot to kill the Tsar. Although it's hard to see Lenin as becoming anything but a revolutionary, the loss of his brother certainly didn't help matters. In 1891, young Vladimir finished law school, but as the brother of an executed wannabe murderer, his prospects were not too good. Instead, Vladimir became a full-time socialist activist under the name of Lenin. In December 1897, he was arrested and exiled to Siberia with his fiancée, Nadyezhda Krupskaya, whom he married in 1898. Returning from exile in 1900, Lenin lived almost totally in Europe for the next 17 years, returning only to watch the 1905 revolution from the sidelines. He ran the Bolshevik Party from various European cities via letters and couriers. The February 1917 revolution caught him by total surprise. When it started, Lenin and Krupskaya were living in a Swiss hovel so close to a sausage factory that they could only stand to open their one window only in the evenings. Lenin was a very old 46 and was close to packing it in. Germany saw in Lenin a great opportunity to maim the Russian war effort. Unlike most Russian socialists, Lenin made no bones about it. He wanted Russia to lose the war in order to speed up Marx's world revolution. In April 1917, the Germans sent Lenin back from Switzerland to Russia in a specially sealed train. They didn't want Lenin spreading Bolshevism in their country, complete with a huge sum of money. The Bolsheviks had been clueless in Lenin's absence. They were actually cooperating with the provisional government, a no-no to Lenin, and even making noises about continuing the war. On his return to Petrograd, Lenin whipped them into shape with the help of his new best friend, Lev Trotsky, hero of the 1905 revolution. Lenin didn't want to wait for the provisional government or the Constituent Assembly to create socialism. Neither did Trotsky. They believed that the time to hesitate was through. Lenin and Trotsky established Bolshevik control over the local Soviets as quickly as possible. For the masses, Lenin kept his message simple. The Bolsheviks would give the Russian people peace, food, and land. All the people had to do was give all power to the Soviets, that is, to the Bolsheviks. In July 1917, Lenin tried to stir up a revolt with street demonstrations. The provisional government set up some machine guns, some demonstrators got shot, and Lenin bravely ran away to Finland disguised as a clean-shaven workman with a ridiculous toupee. While in hiding that summer, Lenin wrote State and Revolution, which claimed that a dictatorship of the proletariat, that is, government through the Soviets, would be necessary before Russia became truly socialist. But before Lenin could install the dictatorship of the proletariat, he had to get out of that haystack he was hiding in and get back to Petrograd. Segment 21D, Red October. The Soviet Union carefully created legends about the October Revolution, but really very little fighting was involved. From mid-October on, rumors of a Bolshevik uprising were common, but nothing concrete happened until October 25, 1917. Even on that day, Petrograd went around its business as usual. But that night, the Bolshevik crew of the cruiser Aurora, anchored in the Neva River, fired a shell at the Winter Palace. The October Revolution was on. The Winter Palace garrison, made up of some military cadets and the Women's Death Battalion, barely resisted the Bolsheviks. Huddled up in a small dining room, the cabinet of the provisional government meekly let themselves get arrested. Only Kerensky himself escaped, dressed, as legend has it, as a female Red Cross nurse. As one might expect, the scruffy Bolsheviks enjoyed working out their hatred for the upper classes by looting the lavish Winter Palace. Later on, when the Soviets had restored it to its original showpiece status, a tasteful marble plaque marked the event. In this room, on the night of 25-26 October 1917, Red Guards, soldiers and sailors, taking the Winter Palace by storm, arrested the counter-revolutionary bourgeois provisional government. The real revolution occurred the next night, when the National Congress of Soviets met. There, the Bolsheviks won 390 out of the 649 elected delegates, about 60% of the total. To show their disapproval of the Bolsheviks' Winter Palace attack, the Mensheviks and socialist revolutionaries stalked out of the meeting, leaving the Bolsheviks and a small handful of allies in total control. It was one of the biggest bad career moves of all time. The Bolsheviks immediately put the National Congress of Soviets under the Sovnarkom, or Council of People's Commissars. The Sovnarkom was led by Lenin as its chairman. The other cabinet positions were divided between Bolshevik commissars. Lenin's right-hand man Trotsky became Commissar for Foreign Affairs. The Georgian, Stalin, became Commissar for Nationalities. Given the sad performance of their provisional government, Russians and foreigners alike thought this new Bolshevik government would fail too. And in fact, it did, 74 years later. That same night, Lenin had the Sovnarkom pass two major decrees. The decree on land abolished all private property and awarded all land to the peasants. Just how the land was to be distributed wasn't important. Lenin had kept his promise. The decree on peace called for peace without annexations or payment of reparations. Unfortunately for Russia, the Central Powers were winning the war on the Eastern Front even before the Russian army fell apart. As we will discuss in the next lecture, the Germans in fact held all the cards. On November 2nd, Lenin and the Commissar for Nationalities, Joseph Stalin, signed the Declaration of Rights of the Peoples of Russia, proposing the following. 1. Equality and sovereignty of all peoples of the former Russian Empire. 2. The rights of the former Russian Empire's people to political self-determination, including the formation of separate states. 3. Abolition of all rights formerly restricted to certain nationalities, Russian, or religions, like Russian Orthodoxy. And 4. Free development of all national minorities and ethnic groups within Russian lands. This lofty-sounding declaration reflected the Bolshevik belief in an imminent world revolution. But in a sense, it was also a response to the 18 points developed by President Woodrow Wilson to end the First World War. But it resembled even more the Emancipation Proclamation, because it freed people and territories, Poland, Ukraine, Belarus, Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, already under another power's control. Still, the Emancipation Proclamation was a major step towards a genuine good. Lenin and Stalin, on the other hand, were making a cynical play for the support of the former Russian Empire's nationalities. Once the Bolsheviks established power over the former Russian Empire, the non-Russian peoples would find Bolshevik reality quite a bit different. On November 19, 1917, the Bolsheviks started peace negotiations with Germany in the town of Brest-Litovsk. Meanwhile, an even bigger problem rose up. The same day, the results of the long-awaited Constituent Assembly elections were announced. The Bolsheviks had hoped their strongholds in Petrograd, Moscow, and the other big cities would give them a majority. In fact, the Bolsheviks got just 23.9% of the popular vote. The Socialist Revolutionary Party, last seen leaving the Congress of Soviets in a huff, received 40% of the vote, more than half again what the Bolsheviks got. The peoples of Russia had elected a Constituent Assembly in which no party enjoyed a majority. Would the Bolsheviks honor their guarantee of freedom and peace? The Bolsheviks' true colors started showing in December 1917, when they established the All-Russian Extraordinary Commission for Combating Counter-Revolution and Sabotage, or CHK. As the original Soviet secret police, the CHK's job was to crush opposition to the Bolshevik regime by any means whatsoever. Although the Bolsheviks pretended they were reaching out to other parties, Lenin would not let the Constituent Assembly become Russia's legitimate government. He allowed the Constituent Assembly to convene for exactly one day, January 5th, 1918. The next day it was shut down for good by Bolshevik guards, and so ended Russian democracy. A week later, on January 12th, the Bolsheviks convened the Third National Congress of Soviets, which declared Russia to be a socialist, federated republic. The Declaration of Rights of the Peoples of Russia was formally accepted and a constitution adopted. Even though Lenin's Sovnarkom still had a few socialist revolutionaries, this was just a temporary thing. Just as Lenin had wanted, all power had been given to the Soviets, and from now on Soviet power would be exercised by the Bolsheviks, or as they renamed themselves in March 1918, the Communist Party. From this time on, the terms Soviet and Communist became one and the same. Segment 21E, Conclusions. 1. Democracy wouldn't have worked. Before the February 1917 revolution, Russia's only experience with democracy was in Great Novgorod's heyday, that is, back in the 1400s. Determined to preserve the autocracy, the Romanov Tsars shunned representative democratic government until 1905. Even political parties were forbidden. Even when Nicholas II granted a Duma in his 1906 manifesto, it was only under pressure. Nicholas did everything in his admittedly feeble powers to throw obstacles in the new Duma's path. The Russian intelligentsia, which should have been welcomed into public life and public affairs decades ago, was forced to take a crash course in parliamentary democracy. This crash course was interrupted by the First World War, and the Russian Empire was interrupted too. 2. The genius of Vladimir Ilyich Lenin. At the risk of oversimplifying somewhat, sometimes history, for whatever reason, produces great people at crucial times in a nation's history. Augustus Caesar was one, as was Emperor Peter the Great, and as was Catherine the Great. Abraham Lincoln was another such great person. So, much less fortunately, were Adolf Hitler, Joseph Stalin, and Vladimir Lenin. Lenin may or may not have been motivated by the death of his elder brother, but Lenin did make the revolution his entire life. When the Bolshevik state came about, in all probability, Lenin worked himself to death, micromanaging everything that came across his desk, hurling out commands and reproaches over the phone, the telegram, and in writing. There was some splinter of Communist Party democracy left in his day. Stalin would fix that problem. But usually Bolshevik freedom consisted of the freedom to do what Lenin said. The Bolsheviks, as a rule, did just that, and they had to show for their efforts the Soviet Union. 3. Bolshevism as a religion. Lenin demanded and got total commitment from the members of the Bolshevik Party. The life of a professional revolutionary was hard and it was dangerous. Only a true believer could stand the strain. Because the Bolsheviks would sacrifice everything for the sake of establishing communism, they believed that they were also permitted to do anything they considered important for their cause. When the Bolsheviks came to power, they immediately started to wipe out the Russian Orthodox Church with things like a League of the Militant Godless and a journal called Atheist at the Workbench. This was in line with Marx's teachings, but it was also politically helpful. After Lenin's death, he was elevated, largely by Stalin, into a semi-divine figure whose every word, as interpreted by Stalin, was infallibly true. Stalin, for his part, played the combined role of son of Lenin and apostle. By basking in Lenin's cult of personality, Stalin's cult of personality grew also. And since communism was a universal religion, Marx, Lenin, and Stalin were billed not only as the greatest people of modern times, but in fact of all human history. 4. Nationalism and the Bolsheviks. One of the rare instances of Lenin's sincere goodwill was his view on the question of nationalities. To Lenin, it was hypocritical for Russian communists to insist that national minorities, like Ukrainians, Poles, Georgians, Belarusians, for example, remain part of a Russian communist nation. Thus, Lenin supported national independence for all of Russia's national minorities, which put him at odds with his Commissar for Nationalities, Iosif Stalin. Lenin's argument was that Marx's world revolution would be happening any day now, and the new communist governments would cheerfully give way to Russia's communist government until the communist paradise arrived. That is, that everybody would want to follow Lenin's orders too. Eventually, the Soviet Union was established on precisely that principle, a grouping of republics with Russia as the first among equals. Yet the escape clause Lenin insisted on including, allowing unhappy republics to secede from the Soviet Union, would in fact lead to the end of the Soviet Union in 1991.